Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the topic, but most importantly, I love to make it something fun and interesting to learn. And in today's episode, I actually have some help from someone who I hope to be working with in the future. And his name is Andres, and he's from Mexico, and he's a gentleman I met on the subreddit, the economic subreddit called Bad Economics. I definitely recommend you use this subreddit if you're as passionate and interested in economics as I am. Very smart people post there daily. There's obviously memes, there's conversations, there's in-jokes. However, lots of papers, lots of books, and many other recommendations are made on there, and I've learned a ton over the years. It's been absolutely incalculably good. But with that out of the way, we're going to be tackling a video made by Economics Explained. And from here on in, he'll be just referred to as EE for the sake of time. And his video on the correlation, or in the case of his video, the causation of wealth and temperature. And so the main point of his thesis is that colder countries tend to be wealthier countries. That's the causation he's going with. So EE himself might have forgotten about that video, but we certainly have not. And we're here to tear it down because it makes many elementary mistakes. And we're going to show you that throughout this video. And so without further ado, let's get into the video. So EE establishes how GDP per capita will be the indicator of wealth to be used, and then he will go on to establish a statistical GDP to temperature correlation. He actually goes into an exception in Australia, which is Darwin, and basically the exception is that Darwin is quite hot, however it's quite well off. EE then goes into the data. On this map, there are so many examples of why this theory is not even remotely plausible on an empirical basis. The entirety of Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia. For example, Afghanistan is warm half of the year and then cold the other half. It's easy to imagine it's a sort of desert because it's in the Middle East, and the Middle East is a desert. However, Afghanistan is actually not in the Middle East, it's in Central Asia. And then there's also the cool parts of Latin America like Argentina and Chile. EE goes on to claim that no conclusive studies have ever been done on this subject. He then talks about how real statistics can be unintuitive. For example, the average amount of arms. And the average amount of arms in a given population would be less than 2. And this makes sense. Some people are born without arms, some people are born with 1 arm, or some people are born with 2 arms, but then lose 1 or 2 arms later in life. He then also claims that, but the data for this theory, temp to GDP correlation, is actually pretty simple. I just want to make a note on outliers. The definition of outlier for this type of theory cannot be based on mere standard deviation calculation. For a social theory, just because a datum is not statistically outlying by being 3 standard deviations from the average does not mean it cannot be considered an outlier, especially when we are talking about variables like GDP, which are not normally distributed and have very ample standard deviations. The explanation. EE tries to explain the correlation. In an attempt to explain why do economies not like it hot, EE goes into the theory of economic selection, which derives its name from the theory of natural selection. The core of the theory is that colder climates are harsher and therefore force people to manage their time and resources better than people in hotter climates. The result is that economically irrational people in hotter climates can thrive, and economically irrational people in colder climates die off and are replaced by more competitive societies.
A basic mud hut is more than sufficient shelter in tropical regions, and food is available to hunt and gather year round. So there was not the same impetus to build larger and more engineered dwellings and become a society that valued storing resources. This kind of forced industriousness would compound itself over many generations to produce a society that values capital goods more so than a society that has had it easy throughout its entire existence.
Never mind the fact that hotter weathers are better for bacteria and viruses to grow in, and that heat and sun limit working hours as much as the cold. Even humouring the argument of natural selection in economics. If warm climates are easy to live in, they should produce more societies, and therefore much more competition. This should result in competitive and competent societies. An exception that throws a wrench in the theory is that historically, great empires resided in warm and hot climates. EE then brings up that, in the past, agriculture used to be much more important than industry and innovation in determining wealth. Agricultural activities thrive in warm weathers, allowing for year-round production. There is truth to this claim about transition from primary to tertiary activities. The problem is that it's presented as evidence. Societies that dominate economically now do so because they are quote-unquote naturally inclined towards innovation. However, in an attempt at a deeper explanation, the video ventures into extremely dubious grounds, making claims not about material limitations of economies, but risking wide sociological generalizations based on weather, much like Montesquieu did. An 18th century philosopher who wrote 30 years before Adam Smith published his first book, Wealth of Nations, and who has been absolutely discredited since the writing of his piece. And his philosophical writings on the subject, because he was not an economist, they form the basis of the theory of which EE draws upon for his video.
The societies which had been forced to adapt and innovate their way around a hostile environment for centuries could now come into their own and lead the world into the age of industry. Other theories also postulate that in colder environments, people are forced to be more tolerant of one another. If someone is going to be locked inside all winter with their friends and family, they are going to need to learn to get along, more so than people who are free to frolic about year round. On top of this, hotter temperatures naturally lead to more aggressive behaviours in human beings. Cold temperatures specifically do the opposite.
Not only is it problematic to jump into wide generalizations, such as people in warmer climates are naturally more prone to violence, it is also a bit of theory that is given without any sort of backing evidence or any citation. It is simply stated as fact. Moreover, recent experience has shown how being stuck inside, whether it is for the winter or for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic, tends to increase domestic violence across the board, regardless of the weather. Now we move on to statistical analysis. A very serious problem with the video and the way it presents the theory is the underlying statistical mistakes made in interpreting the data.
When we do statistical analysis, we also look at a value called the R-squared. Statisticians have a knack for making everything sound more complicated than it actually is.
Statistics are nuanced, which is why statisticians try to be very precise with things like definitions. This is going to come up again later.
So what the R-squared value means in plain English is how much of the result is determined by the variables in the model compared to other factors that haven't been considered. For example, if we look at the correlation between height and weight, we would expect a positive relationship. The taller someone is, the heavier they tend to be. Using this example, we may find an R-squared value of 0.5, meaning that 50% of someone's weight is determined by their height. This would mean that another 50% is explained by some other factor or factors, not already in our model. In this example, it would probably be how round they are.
This part is actually incorrect. What R-squared actually means is the proportion of the variance in the dependent variable that is predictable from the independent variable. Just because two events follow a similar pattern doesn't mean one causes the other, even if one can be used to predict the other. For example, if you measure oxygen density in the atmosphere at different heights, you'll find the atmosphere is less dense the higher you go. If you do the same experiment with hydrogen density, you'll find a similar pattern. Hydrogen and oxygen behave similarly then. Therefore, you could look at the oxygen density at any one point of a mountain and use that to predict the hydrogen density. This, however, does not mean that the hydrogen density depends on the oxygen density. When you look at weight, you know beforehand the height determines total weight. So if you find a correlation of, let's say, 0.5, it is correct to say that height causes 50% of body weight. The only thing that the R-squared value tells us on its own is that by looking at height, we can reliably predict 50% of weight. The interpretation that the relationship between these two variables is cause and effect is something that happens entirely outside the statistical model and only in the investigator's head.
The relationship between temperature and GDP per capita gave us an R-squared value of 0.09. This means that 9% of a country's prosperity is determined by its temperature.
This is where the statistical nuance comes in, and the reason why EE shouldn't be so quick to dismiss statisticians. The statement that, looking at the R2 score, temperature determines 9% of wealth is flat out wrong. The correct statement is that by looking at temperature, we can predict 9% of wealth. This may seem like splitting hairs, but actually isn't. Think back to the oxygen density example. Just because oxygen density can predict hydrogen density, it doesn't mean it's permissible to say that oxygen density determines hydrogen density directly. Now, EE does acknowledge that correlation does not mean causation. However, when looking at how this applies to his model, he says the following.
So, is it possible that the relationship between temperature and economic prosperity is just another example of this spurious relationship? Well, no. If this were the case, there would need to be an unknown third variable linking both of these factors.
And just like that, the possibility of spurious correlation is dismissed.
Given that there is no hidden variable between temperature and GDP, it is safe to conclude that this correlation is not spurious.
No, it is not safe to conclude that the correlation is not spurious because the cause and effect relationship between temperature and wealth is not a given. EE has taken the R-squared score and interpreted it as a certain measure of causation. Hence, he considers the cause-effect relationship to be given without further evidence. So now we finish up with on the theory of forced industriousness. To engage directly with the theory and ideas and their content, rather than the way they are presented, it would actually be useful to look at more information besides what EE presents. One problematic bit is the theory of quote-unquote forced industriousness, and the idea that not only cold but developed countries in general are more hardworking than the global south. In fact, if we look at the OECD's database on labour, we can see there is an inverse correlation between wealth and average hours of work per week. It turns out that countries that are less developed work more hours, have less vacations, and have lower wages. With the higher population and more work hours per week, lower developed countries should steamroll in the economic race, right? The real difference has to do with the factors of production. Laborers in lower developed countries are less efficient due to differences in all forms of capital. This has very little to do with the temperature outside. Either way, the notion of forced industriousness does not hold up to scrutiny. The widely held belief that these less developed countries are quote-unquote lazy is simply not based on the observable evidence as it stands today. Here is a chart mapping the World Bank's GDP data with the American Economic Review's working hours information. There is an additional source proving that quote-unquote industriousness, depending on how it's defined, can be better understood as inversely correlated to wealth, which works against EE's argument. As we've established, there are multiple issues with the theory of economic selection based on temperature. It would be best to do a recap of the essential issues with the theory itself, moving past looking at the way EE presents it. Firstly, as mentioned previously, the origin of this theory is a legal analysis by a philosopher, not an economist, published in the 18th century and 30 years before Adam Smith had even published The Wealth of Nations. The book itself is riddled with notions that today would be considered humorous at best and offensive at worst. Second, looking at quote-unquote the data, it would seem that there are more outliers than inliers. EE dismisses historical outliers only by introducing an even wilder theory, that of forced industriousness and a propensity for violence, without any sort of evidence to back this up. Rather than accepting that, historically, temperature does not seem to determine wealth, this theory requires us to accept a cartoonish explanation for the entirety of human history. Power relations and wealth didn't change because of things like imperialism, globalization, political and economic systems, or even other material factors such as resources. No, it would seem power and wealth changed because Western Europe and Western countries are quote-unquote naturally more apt for industriousness, innovation, and peaceful, organized coexistence. And to finish up with, this leaves a final issue, an ethical matter with the theory. It is one of many theories that seeks to naturalize contemporary wealth distribution. Instead of asking what conscious human actions may have led to an unequal world as we see today, these kind of theories seek to explain away inequality and poverty as logical and natural consequences of factors beyond our control. So of course from here we could continue on and on, however we've touched upon the main points. And I hope this was enough to help you understand why EE's video does not stand up to even the slightest bit of scrutiny and lacks any sort of proper model or any sort of good evidence to back it up with, other than the aforementioned 18th century philosopher who started it all. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask it below and I'll answer directly, or I'll collect the comments together and make another video about it. But thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate, and share all the good stuff. Definitely helps my channel. And I'll see you guys next time.